How are you feeling about the markets right now?
Not great.
Anxious?
Optimistic. Worried.
No! No!
Terrified.
It's not too clear what's going to happen in the future, in the near future, long-term future.
Should China worry about U.S. tariffs?
We never worry about it.
Why not?
Yeah. We only focus on our...
Xi Jinping warned clearly. Don't back US deals at Beijing's expense. As the US offered tariff relief to countries pulling away from China, Beijing responded not with noise, but with precision. A Boeing jet was returned without a word. Then came the warning. Any deal that harms China's interests will trigger countermeasures. No country was singled out. But from Tokyo to Brussels, the message was unmistakable. If you side with Washington at Beijing's expense, don't expect silence in return. Here's the twist. This wasn't aimed at the US. It was aimed at everyone else, turning America's allies into China's new front line. The real question, in a world where trade now signals loyalty, what happens to countries trying to stay neutral? Before China returned the Boeing jet? Before it warned countries to stop appeasing the US? Before the threat of global retaliation echoed through Asian capitals? There were whispers, not of war, but of conditional peace. In April 2025, as Trump unleashed a massive 145% tariff on China, his administration quietly offered temporary relief to other countries, under one condition: distance yourself from Beijing. But Beijing noticed. These weren't dramatic announcements. They were subtle recalibrations. Each country hedging its bets, realigning just enough to stay in Washington's good graces without entirely alienating Beijing. But in China's eyes, every move away, however small, was recorded. And then came the first visible consequence. Without any formal statement, China began to quietly stall incoming Boeing aircraft approvals. Then it acted. A brand new Boeing 737 MAX, fully painted in Xiamen Airlines colors and completed in Boeing's Zhoushan facility, the company's first and only completion center in China, was flown back to Seattle without ceremony. No media event, no explanation, just quiet rejection. The message from Beijing was crystal clear. Every deal with Washington would now be scrutinized and remembered. Hours later, China's Ministry of Commerce issued a carefully worded statement, warning of reciprocal countermeasures against any country that strikes a deal with the US at China's expense. The statement used language sharp enough to chill diplomacy. Negotiating with a tiger for its skin will only lead to mutual failure. That phrase would soon echo across Chinese state media, regional press, and foreign policy journals. And just like that, the playing field changed. China no longer needed to pressure Washington. It was now using trade diplomacy to pressure Washington's allies. Not by threatening them directly, but by signaling that proximity to Trump's trade deals could come with hidden costs. It didn't need to call out any nation by name. The message had been delivered in silence, wrapped in economic retaliation, and underlined by the quiet flight of a single aircraft. What began as quiet retaliation soon transformed into something much larger and far more deliberate. After allowing the world to digest the message of the returned Boeing, China stepped out of the shadows and spoke clearly. This was no longer about bilateral friction. It was a warning to every country sitting across the table from Washington. If you engage in a deal that harms us, you are no longer neutral. You are part of the problem. The statement from China's Ministry of Commerce, delivered just days after the Boeing jet returned to Seattle, was unequivocal. China firmly opposes any party reaching a deal at the expense of China's interests, it said. If this happens, China will not accept it and will resolutely take reciprocal countermeasures. But what stood out wasn't just the language, it was the target audience. The rhetoric was amplified by action. China doubled down on its economic arsenal, not by escalating against the United States, but by applying pressure to the periphery. US companies with close ties to Chinese industries were quietly added to blacklists. critical mineral exports were restricted, a move that hit not only the US, but also countries like Japan and South Korea that depend on Chinese rare earths for manufacturing. At the same time, China filed a lawsuit against the United States at the World Trade Organization, signaling its intent to frame Washington's tactics as global violations, not just bilateral grievances. And it wasn't just trade. The diplomatic arm of Beijing was suddenly active on every front. Xi Jinping, who had not left China since the beginning of 2025, embarked on a high-profile trip through Southeast Asia, stopping in Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia. In each capital, the message was consistent. China is not isolating itself. It is building partnerships. It is defending fairness. It is resisting what it called unilateral bullying. These weren't casual visits. They were counter-moves, timed to undercut Trump's outreach in the exact regions where US influence was rising. China also shifted its narrative. The trade war was no longer being framed as a defensive necessity. It was rebranded as a moral stand. Chinese media declared that the US was engaging in hegemonic politics. State-run editorials warned countries like the European Union not to be complicit in America's law of the jungle approach to global trade. And the Ministry of Commerce issued statements that read more like manifestos than bureaucratic updates, calling on nations to join a movement that would resist economic coercion and defend multilateralism. In this pivot, China was no longer content to play the victim. It was now positioning itself as the enforcer of a new set of rules, or rather, the protector of the old ones. The language was couched in fairness and internationalism. What made this shift so significant wasn't just the escalation of threats, it was the strategic reframing of the conflict. While the US used tariffs as leverage, China was transforming its response into a loyalty test. Not for America, for everyone else. As China expanded its counterpressure and the US continued dangling tariff relief as an incentive, the rest of the world found itself in a narrowing corridor. Nations that had long relied on both economies were now forced to reassess not just where they traded, but what that trade signaled politically. The trade war had transformed. It was no longer a dispute between two superpowers. It had become a test of alignment for every country caught in between. Some responded with quiet adjustments. Japan, for instance, announced it would increase agricultural imports from the US, particularly soybeans and rice. While Tokyo never directly stated it was distancing itself from China, the timing and scale of the decision spoke volumes. Trade analysts noted that Japan's economy is deeply intertwined with both nations, with roughly 20% of its profitability tied to US markets and another 15% to China. The subtle message was clear. We're shifting our balance ever so slightly, enough to be noticed, but not enough to provoke. South Korea, under similar pressure, prepared a multi-sector package involving American liquefied natural gas LNG imports, shipbuilding ventures, and expanded investment projects. Meanwhile, Chinese state media began warning Seoul not to repeat what they described as the THAAD mistake, referring to South Korea's 2017 deployment of a US missile defense system, which led to a harsh economic backlash from China. In India, the decision was more calculated. Facing the threat of a 26% blanket tariff if it failed to strike a deal with the US, New Delhi moved quickly to open talks. US Vice President J.D. Vance visited Prime Minister Modi to discuss terms. India, which had maintained relatively balanced relations with both powers, now had to choose between retaining access to US markets or protecting its expanding economic partnership with China, especially in the digital, infrastructure, and pharmaceutical sectors. Vietnam, once viewed as a neutral player and an economic alternative to China for global manufacturers, found itself under intense scrutiny. US trade officials accused Hanoi of enabling Chinese transshipment, the practice of routing Chinese goods through Vietnamese ports to avoid US tariffs. In response, Vietnamese officials pledged to tighten enforcement. Even the European Union, which tried to maintain strategic autonomy, wasn't immune. What makes this moment so dangerous is that no country wants to pick a side, yet none can avoid being interpreted as doing just that. Every soybean order, every LNG contract, every customs crackdown becomes a geopolitical message. And in a world where both Washington and Beijing are demanding clarity, ambiguity itself is now a risk. The result is a silent, global reshuffling. Supply chains are moving. Diplomatic language is hardening. And trade, once seen as a domain of mutual benefit, is now a battleground of strategic symbolism. By now, the world understood that tariff disputes were no longer just economic instruments. They had evolved into ideological fault lines, dividing not just goods and services, but strategic postures, spheres of influence, and even future diplomatic credibility. What Trump had launched as an aggressive protectionist maneuver had quietly matured into something far more potent, a global loyalty index, disguised as trade policy. And China, in turn, had transformed its retaliation into a selective enforcement strategy. Together, the two powers had redefined trade alignment as a test of allegiance. And that test was happening in real time. The US had learned a lesson from its failed attempts to contain Chinese tech through direct bans. Economic isolation was most effective when outsourced. No official memorandum declared this strategy, but the patterns were clear. Countries weren't just expected to negotiate better trade terms, they were expected to show restraint, to slow or sever connections with Chinese companies, to resist Huawei's 5G networks, to reevaluate Belt and Road projects, and to adjust procurement decisions that had once been purely commercial. In turn, Beijing weaponized access. Not just access to Chinese markets, but access to supply chains, raw materials, and long-standing diplomatic goodwill. Rare earth minerals, critical to everything from iPhones to fighter jets, were placed under stricter export licensing regimes. US firms were blacklisted from working with Chinese tech partners. Hollywood studios were given reduced slots for theatrical releases in China. But these were just the surface-level moves. The more strategic maneuver was psychological, creating an atmosphere in which countries began to self-censor their economic behaviors out of fear that Beijing was watching and recording. And as the US issued exclusive deals and China retaliated against any erosion of loyalty, every nation caught in the middle was left to decipher a message with no safe answer. Should a country choose Washington, it risked losing preferential trade routes, investment, and infrastructure support from the world's second-largest economy. Should it lean toward Beijing, it faced retaliation from the world's largest consumer market and the punitive tariff regime that came with it. And should it try to remain neutral, it risked being penalized by both, for indecision, for ambiguity, for strategic silence. This is what made the new era so volatile. It was functioning on alignment enforcement, the practice of using trade as a lever to punish uncertainty and reward ideological proximity. The world was no longer choosing suppliers, it was choosing sides. And while neither the US nor China had publicly declared a Cold War, the architecture was unmistakable. Exclusive deals, retaliatory strikes, diplomatic ultimatums, proxy lobbying, and the slow erosion of multilateral trade forums. The rules of global commerce were no longer being challenged. They were being replaced, not through consensus, but through pressure. Today, countries are no longer navigating trade policy. They are navigating a minefield of perception. So here is the real question. In an age where trade deals are coded political messages, where tariffs are tools of psychological warfare, and where one returned jet can unravel years of diplomatic progress, what happens to the countries that still believe they can stand in the middle? Drop a comment for more breaking news.